this is an opportunity not only to ask questions from the audience, but for panelists to respond to each other. And my own sense is that it was fascinating set of presentations, all really along the lines of the raking light that catches all of the contours. And I guess if there are any questions, my own question, I suppose, to the panelists is really whether at the end of a day of this sort, the category of extreme seems to be useful, or whether it only has use as a kind of heuristic device to gather all of you together. Is there something more lasting to extreme, or in fact is it just a device?
I think it's terrific. My own bent is toward probably the use of the heuristic anyway. I'm just interested in the kind of frisson and energy and revelation that comes from bringing these such distinct practices together and finding these continuities. And I guess I'd be curious, what practitioners on the panel really learned from one another, and where maybe some of the differences lie as well.
We've been collecting time-based media, digital type objects for a number of years now, and don't really have a policy either for acquisition or for care, for migration, for, the furthest we've gotten is putting together a committee, a group of people to try and determine the policies. Mm-hmm. But listening to you this morning, some of the follow-ups was great, gave me a number of ideas to bring to the group, so thank you.
Oh, interesting.
Thank you for that, that are applicable generally to more broadly than just digital materials. And it helps raise a lot of, I think, question some of the assumptions that we make about non-digital, our traditional material as well. So thank you.
Yeah, I found it interesting that you said you would like to change that kind of catalog setup. For instance, that the conservators, they should become public maybe in a different way. That's how I understood you, that they're not just there to have a technical report at the end of a catalog with, that there are some kind of appendix or footnote. So what I get from this as well is it's still really a process that's just beginning, as it seems also with your contribution, to talk about some of the problems of these practices and make them public in order to facilitate debate, and also how to make the processes public in this kind of more practical sense. So I'm just curious maybe to hear from those who are really getting into it in the material side. So what other processes could be imagined, or what other catalog? Me as somebody who's editing books once in a while, I would be very curious to hear how would you feel more, better acknowledged maybe in such a format.
Well, certainly including information of conservation history and maybe recent treatment, and the general information that's provided in the galleries is certainly one way. Again, as I said at the end of my presentation, it's great that we have a presence in the galleries now, but really the overarching concept we're talking about is integration, right, Peter? And it would be great for that information to be integrated with the art historical information in the permanent gallery display.
Let me ask a question. Since we have an architect at the table, is it possible to imagine a trajectory that takes the conservator, and we also, I think we're lucky that we only have an ex-curator in the room, so I can say this. And that, could we imagine a trajectory that gets first the conservator out from behind and into the gallery working, and then gets the conservator actually doing some organization of the materials, in the same way that an architect is trained to actually build buildings, but also is expected to think about buildings and think about space and theorize as well. There, the distinction between curator and conservator is actually completely eliminated in the expectations, training, and function of the architect. So is that something that could be possible for conservators also?
Absolutely. There are a number of conservators at the museum that are crossovers, that are curating exhibitions. I also think, as we were discussing last night, that the research aspect of the work we do, I think perhaps because of training, because of schooling, that conservators are more aggressive researchers. We were talking, Stephen was sort of talking about the curator as connoisseur rather than researcher or historian, and that the conservator makes quite a bit of crossover there. But as far as what you're asking about is as far as the use of the space in general?
No, I'm thinking of the intellectual profile.
Well, you know, something that it strikes me about this question, and I think it comes to ground in many of the presentations we've had today, is the distinction between what I think is a sort of normative rhetoric of the museum, that the object is in stasis. The object on the wall, the object on the plinth, in the vitrine is inert. And the museum is, everything about the museum, as conventionally understood in this era, and for quite some time, is about this kind of, you know, heterotopia of suspended animation, where these things come in and they don't come out, they don't check out. And yet, you know, the paradigm or the perspective of the conservator is that they are dynamic objects in flux. I find that a really fascinating perspective, and it's interesting to play the thought experiment of what would a museology be that is founded on the dynamic object, the object as a living object, the object as a performance. What would it be to flip that on its head, where the connoisseurship is something that's taking place backstage, as it were, and you know, the conservation is actually understood as the address we bring to the object in the first instance, that it's an object that's changing in time. It seems like it's a paradigm that might have some salience today when we're becoming conscious of our own impact as a species on a planet that we thought was static, which, you know, it turns out is anything but. And, you know, perhaps we could learn something from these objects about our impact more globally, if we were to flip that perspective. I mean, I don't know how it's going to happen, but...
Well, thank you for articulating that better than I ever could. But also this morning you mentioned the concept of, you know, the fact that you couldn't use or you couldn't view digital material without changing it. And as I mentioned with the time capsule, it's obvious there that this dynamism was created where the public, being able to view what was going on, actually started to change what was going on. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a fascinating subject to start to drill down into, as to what happens when it becomes dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
Several years ago, I performed a survey where I asked people coming into the churches, viewing the wall paintings, what they thought of the restorations or what they valued in wall paintings. And I found that the views of the public are very different from the conservators. What they emphasized was that they wanted to understand the wall paintings, what stories, the narrative function of the wall paintings, and their attraction as tourist objects, which was very different from the conservators, who placed very much value on the the historical value, the material aspects of the painting. And this, I think, is very interesting and might have an impact on conservation now in public art, where more and more projects are being competitive bidding is done on these projects, where they are done to please the public. So this might have an influence on how planning is done in conservation projects in the future.
To go back to your question, Peter, about the possible collaboration in spirit that might exist between architects and conservation specialists, as opposed to necessarily curators, I think what emerged for me very strongly is that conservators and architects are, by definition, people who are interested in how things are made, and the processes by which, as far as architects are concerned, not only volumes are created, but materials are suspended in space, and you can't be an architect without actually knowing what happens behind the surface that's seen. And I mean, the best curators I've had the privilege to work with are people who are deeply interested in how things, the material qualities of the things that they tell stories about. Right? But I've never once been involved working in a museum when I haven't heard a curator kind of take me aside and say, a conservator take me aside, the curator of painting knows a little bit about how that was actually put together, but let me tell you, all the other aspects of it, which is fascinating. I mean, architects want that for architects. And so I think that the process-based, the formal implications of processes and how they engage materials are vital to both those ways of thinking about objects. The other thing I was impressed with as the non-conservator on the panel is the diversity of objects and the limits that need to be placed theoretically or conceptually around an object in order to talk about its conservation. I will never think of a dead animal in quite the same way again, and I was fascinated with so many of the slides you showed, but the one that really will stick in my mind forever is the red door, the perfect disappearing perspective with the storage rack after rack after rack. And knowing that inevitably some part of those things will be mildewed or attacked by vermin or whatever, it raises the question which goes to the heart of why it is architects are called by museums to work, which is, how much stuff do you hold on to? Mm-hmm. And for what reasons? And obviously that's a big can of worms, but what I thought fascinating about your presentation was to say, here is the product of all of this 19th century, in our value system, falsely guided notion about naturalism and colonializing and bringing back images of exotic places, and it's left us with all this stuff. Yeah. And I may be reading into what you're saying, but I think there's the suggestion that if they'd only brought back half as much, we'd be twice as happy. But the conservation ethos of the early 21st century is we don't dare deaccession anything because we are presumptuous enough to think we'll know what people 50, 80, 100 years from now will find interesting. So the question is, if you play that out to its logical conclusion, then all the warehouse space in the Bronx is taken over by the Met, and all of Virginia turns into the back room of the Smithsonian, and it just doesn't stop. And of course the architects are thrilled because people keep asking them to add to museums. But one fine day, the public says, we're actually more interested in music again than going to museums. And then it's a question of resources, it's a question of engagement in public discourse, and it's the question of what is the knowledge about which we justify our obsession for holding on to everything.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that's why I find that place so educational and so interesting, and I don't believe it really that they claim it can't be made permanently public. You can book a tour once a month, I think, but I also think that a lot of people don't even know about this opportunity. Because as I couldn't show any images because I promised them not to, really the things are coming apart. They have really bandages, they're in a really, really bad state, so you can't master this huge amount of stuff. It simply falls apart, and it shows the uterus, but it also shows really, I mean, standing in that space gives me a bodily knowledge about what colonialism means just for, you know, the animal side, let alone, of course, their collections with human remains as well, which is a completely different problem. So there are stuffed humans in Vienna, for instance, which are never shown publicly, of course, but that happened, and it hardly is mentioned in the conservation manuals, but the same firms also stuffed humans, of course. Yeah, of course. I mean, that they are treated as animals. This is what Agamben wrote about. So I think it would be interesting to maybe make public to use it in order to, you know, work through this phase of a specific British history within this institution, maybe, and then maybe it's been used up in that. I don't know, but I think that would be way more interesting. It's disintegrating anyway. It will be gone at some point. So why not have it as a public event or public decision how to deal with that exactly? So I completely agree, and I think that space is amazing.
Yeah, to be sure.
Yeah.
You know, I feel like I've seen one kind of architectural or landscape, perhaps, avatar of this problem that you just learned, Stephen, in the Harvard Depository, offsite storage. For Harvard's libraries, with a group of students. MetaLab made a film about the Harvard Depository last year, and it's a fascinating site. It's about a half an hour's drive outside of Boston, and it's by far the largest plurality of material in the libraries is in offsite storage. Some 10 million objects, mostly books, but also archives, also film, magnetic tape. There's a great deal of material out there, and I say architecture, but it's not really. I mean, it's an envelope of cinder block, a vast modular warehouse system, state-of-the-art technology circa 1989. And what's most curious about it to me is the environmental conditions within the building are spec'd to preserve that material for 500 years, and that's the specification that they cite. The materials out of which the building is constructed are expected to last 75 to 100 years. So it's like this kind of husk that is, you know, the material will slough off over time and regrow in a sense. And it's modular, so as they fill up, a new bay will be added. And one imagines, you know, the first bay gradually falling into ruins and material being taken out of it. And this thing, sort of this object, this hyper object, kind of caterpillaring around the site over the longue durée, gradually eating up the forest. And that seems to me the kind of you know, provisionality and you know, endless incompleteness of the archive kind of bodying forth.
I have two questions. One is an observation, which is really following this idea of the organic collection. In the book that you wrote with Jeffrey Schnapp, The Library Beyond the Book, you talk about the way in which thinking about the various functions, as opposed to just the storage of books, but the various functions that go on in a library, one could imagine then different structures to house it. And I wonder if our conversation today is in thinking about the conservation angle and its questions and possibilities, suggests a way of rethinking the museum beyond the object, right? In a sense, some of the things that we've talked about today, I think each of the papers, one could imagine reorienting a museum around the kinds of questions that came up in the different papers, which would be in some sense turning things on their head, or at least sideways. And you know, Ivan, as the sole curator in the room, or ex-curator even, you should feel free to pipe up, because this is a kind of conservation-centric approach. The other thing I wanted to mention, just when I ended the morning with the third temporality being the future, I wasn't quite thinking about Petra, your talk to come, but it does suggest that if one can, because of one's knowledge of materials, imagine what will happen to things. Then what opens up is the possibility of a politics based on conservation knowledge. And I don't think the word politics has been mentioned here today, but I wonder if that's something that we want to think about, maybe as part of or related to the museum beyond the object, is the question of, is there a politics? Professor Helvig talked about, is there a grand unified single theory for conservation? Well, is there a single politics for conservation that emerges out of conversation such as this? Or are there various kinds of politics? But is there any politics would be the starting point to the question.
Yeah, I think there definitely is. If you say you follow the material, and that means you follow the life of the objects or the kind of networks they build, and you make that public. I think part of that definitely, and this is also maybe a question I would have for you, when this Juno statue, for instance, was restored, which I'm sure the face, I mean, that's controversial, as you also mentioned, it's quite a drastic change, and why not the arm, why the face? I'm just interested how, what kind of role the sponsor or the person, the patron plays in this, that the face needs to be proper and pretty, and I think there were a couple that it said facelift in the press. In another example that you showed a webpage, it said it's more aesthetically pleasing, it was about painting, I think. So there are some politics involved, and I think that should be part of the conservation network, to say that goes on public display, that needs to be up for debate, and that needs to become transparent, I think, to the everyday visitor. I think that would be a chance to also question the museum complex again, which I would find very interesting, but not from a perspective of, oh God, I know it better, but rather from following the material from the ground, so to say.
I don't believe there's any unifying theory. I think that generally basic training of the conservator is the mindset that no amount of resource is too much, to throw at the preservation of our cultural heritage. And I think of late, we're at least in some corners of the discipline that's being questioned. And it really is a matter of, for each individual collection, to make a determination about what's the collection, what's the purpose of it, how it's to be used, how long do they intend for it to last, and then make a determination about what's an appropriate amount of resource to throw at it based on that, because the answers to those questions will be different for everyone. And so I don't see how there can really be any sort of unifying, some single rule to be applied to all. The British Standards group put out this PAS 198 several years ago, publicly available specification on collections management, in which about environments to maintain, light exposure, pollutants, the museum environment in general, and basically the document begins by, well, you can't answer any of these questions until you answer the first question, which is, how long are you trying to make the collection last? And everything sort of follows that. But I think that that's something that was heresy to talk about before. Just beginning to get discussed.
I feel like there ought to be, and I'm not sure what it is, some connection between some of what we've talked about today with respect to the material conditions of cultural heritage and ephemerality versus preservation, and the ways in which we're talking about our data, as it were, in the network world. Questions about the right to be forgotten, about the disposition of one's personal information, where it's stored, how it's stored, who has access to it. These seem like, in a kind of strange key, also curatorial questions, also archival questions. I don't have a ready connection. I just feel like there's some kind of rhyming connection there that makes me curious to pursue further. Is there some perspective from museum practice more broadly, from the archives, and from the material kind of ground truthing of conservation practice that can be brought to bear on some of these questions that seem to be questions in an entirely other realm. I don't know. I'm provoking myself with that question, but perhaps there's some kind of politics of transparency, of participation, that certainly are some of the virtues that digital culture seems to want to put into struggle with the commercial and with the neoliberal. I don't know where to take that, but I'm curious to think about that some more.
I mean, in what you were just saying, and I think in some ways it does perhaps make a connection to this issue of how long things are conserved and under what conditions. It seems to me that it's inherently a political discussion, because as soon as you factor in the question of limited resources, it's a debate about what gets spent on what. And again, speaking as the outsider, the architect, architects deal with this all the time. I have yet to meet an institution that hands you a program and hands you a budget and says, watch, they're perfectly coordinated.
Spend as much money as you want.
No, exactly, and I've yet to hear that, right? So what happens is, inevitably, there's a moment when the architect comes back and says, you say you want this and you can actually afford that, and the site will only allow you to do this. So we need to have a discussion how to get those things into the right place. If you want to see the political organization of an institution, the best way to do it is to tell the group that you've assembled that they can't all have what they've been saying for years and years and years. They absolutely have to have in order for their department to do their work. It's obviously not just museums, it's any number of institutional efforts. And I was remarking to somebody during the break that one of the reasons that the Louvre, which was actually functioning as 7 independent collections when we first got involved, came together and decided to make one large institution, is that exceptionally every single department was guaranteed they would have at least 20 to 30% additional space to show all the stuff. And that was the condition if they were being told, but they were given a week, literally, to draft a public statement saying, we all endorse this project, this is what we're going to do. So the Louvre, I won't go on too long, but the Louvre is actually designed to eventually receive 6 million visitors. That was seen as the absolute maximum that could ever possibly be taken in. And there were, contrary to what's happened now because of security constraints, there were actually 5 entrances, not just the pyramid. Last year there were 10 million visitors. They are now having to rethink how to get those visitors in. The photographs that were shown of the Salle des États shows what a nightmare it is to be there. And no one is yet willing to say, how do we stop, or how do we wind it back? Or is there a strategy that acknowledges that there is a threshold beyond which we can no longer continue to spend resources to bring more and more and more and more people to see these objects, especially since the popular imagination seems to fix on the same set of objects, at least for the last decades. So it seems to me that those are inherently political questions, that's an argument that both questions values on the one hand and who gets to decide on the other. It's rarely the architect.
Well, in my case, it's oftentimes literally the politicians that chime in. Thankfully, this all happened before my tenure at Air and Space, but the whole controversy around the Enola Gay restoration. It's estimated that we spent about 300,000 man-hours restoring that one airplane, which is just a staggering amount of resources. And also, I'm always haunted by the fact that we see that decisions that were made about particular projects 10 years ago, 20 years ago, are not the same decisions we make today. And I know that we are continually evolving, and I know that people are going to look upon what we're doing right now with maybe an unfavorable eye. But knowing that it's the best decision that we can make at the time with the resources that we have on hand. But with the Enola Gay, the museum wanted to portray a very balanced and objective interpretation of what that meant to not only the Americans but to the Japanese, and that did not fly at all. And so the interpretation of the Enola Gay is basically an airplane. You should know what it is. when you walk by it, but unfortunately the interpretation of it is not really what it should be in a museum setting, because it's been influenced by outside pressures. And same thing with the restoration. I think the level of restoration that was performed on that airplane 20 years ago is probably much more heavy-handed than the approach that we would have taken today.
Do you have any questions from the audience?
I just want to comment that, Matthew, I thought you raised the idea of objectifying the conservator, and it reminded me of when humans were used in exhibits in World's Fair or at the Natural History Museum here in New York. I don't know, I just think I think it was a beautiful experiment, and it's so great to see how it's blossomed.
It certainly has, there are unanticipated consequences of moving out into the public realm. But thus far, all the conservators have reacted very positively. As a matter of fact, they compete with each other to get their projects into spaces, because just like it was in my interest to raise the profile of the whole department, they're interested in raising the profiles of their individual labs, and they compete with one another to get into those spaces. So they're very happy to have their projects in there, and nobody seems to mind. Everybody's gotten very used to working while being watched.
I think I have to. Steve, do you want to tell your story about the Veronese painting, which you were telling us at dinner last night?
What was amusing about this restoration, which, as I said earlier, had to happen in situ because the painting was deemed too fragile to roll up and move, and that would have been the only way. And that room is so historic that we couldn't come in and remove a couple of bricks in the wall or slice through the doorway. So they were really stuck between a rock and a hard place. And so that was the determination back in 1990, I believe, to just do what you did, to partition it off and to create this plastic enclosure with all of the air handling and the rest. And there was a French team and there was an Italian team, and my curator and administration friends at the Louvre would say, "Those people never used to dress that well." Look at that. And that Italian woman, what does she think she's doing? She's not climbing up that scaffolding. So there was this performative piece that suddenly turned
Right, so that's,
these
that
humble
lurks.
conservators into real actors and actresses.
Well, I was intrigued by the provision of the whiteboard, and I mean, it seems like what you describe in part is a kind of evolution of practice that long before the press showed up for the time capsule, your colleagues were finding ways to address the public and make that encounter more articulate, and make it work for them in new ways. So instead of sticking to the corners. And maybe things like the whiteboard are elements of that practice that allow that barrier to be made more permeable.
Yeah, and it makes for a sort of a constant give and take, which is the boards are updated every day, and there's a certain amount of mining that goes on through that. But there's a lot of back and forth, and that what I was trying, what I had hoped to convey was the evolution of the project, and it was very organic, but how we got to where we are today, and the fact that I'm still trying to figure out where to take it, where to hope to take it from here.
Any more questions? Well, if not, I think I would represent the audience's feelings if I said that we owe you a great debt of thanks, all of you. Fascinating conversation, very interesting. I'm sure we'll spend lots of time as we walk through the snow thinking about conservation on this first day of spring. And I thank all of you, the audience, for coming. The refreshments remain outside as well as in the back of the room for you to enjoy. And I think we'll just give our panelists a warm round of applause.